Hi, I'm Suzanne McAllister, and this is Full Circle. I'm glad you could be with us today. We're going to talk about hearing loss, and you know it's a major health concern. In fact, nearly 32 million Americans suffer from some type of hearing loss, and about 15% of those are baby boomers. Well, here to shed some light on the subject, or perhaps I should say turn up the volume on the subject of hearing loss, we have Susan Rardin. Susan is an audiologist. She's also the owner of Hear Here, and I'd like to welcome you to the program.
Thanks, Suzanne.
Susan, I'd also like to thank you for your sponsorship of our closed captioning. It really makes a big difference for so many of our viewers in need of that service.
I've heard that from many of my patients, so I'm happy to be able to be a part of it.
Well, thanks. Let's talk about what you do as an audiologist and the role that you play when you interact with someone who does have a hearing loss.
An audiologist is a person who has a university degree. In the past, it was a master's degree. You could also have a PhD if you wanted to pursue the more research-oriented portion of the field. These days, the degree is now what is called an AUD, which is a clinical doctorate. So students coming out now come out with their AUD. But an audiologist is someone who can test your hearing and your balance system, and that can aid in a doctor diagnosing specific conditions that you might have with your ear. And if we find that the problem that you have is a hearing problem that cannot be fixed medically, surgically, then we can also dispense hearing aids to that person.
So we have lots to cover on today's program because it really is so involved. You mentioned the balance. How can you then determine whether someone has a balance problem versus the hearing problem?
There are a lot of ear issues that can cause problems with balance, and our inner ear has a hearing portion as well as a balance portion. And so we have different types of tests that we can use to help determine what is going wrong in the balance mechanism, and that combined with the results of the hearing test can guide the doctor in determining what is wrong with that person, what kind of a diagnosis do they have, so they can help plot out a treatment.
Well, you mentioned the inner ear, and if I go back to my early anatomy classes, I remember that there's the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. Right. You talked about the role of the inner ear. What about the role of the outer ear and the middle ear?
The outer ear, its job is to channel the sound waves into the middle ear, basically. So the pinna, which is, if you notice, is kind of shaped like a funnel, helps funnel that sound into the ear canal. That is basically your outer ear. Our middle ear consists of the eardrum and the ear bones, the 3 ear bones, which are the smallest bones in the human body, and they transmit the sound from the eardrum to the inner ear. And the job of the middle ear is to take the sound, amplify it louder, because as any type of energy progresses, you lose energy as you go. So its job is to power it up to overcome the amount of loss it's going to have as it goes through the whole system.
Almost like a speaker or something in our own
like an
ear?
amplifier.
Okay, so can we have hearing loss in any one of those 3 areas?
You can have hearing loss from a problem in any one of those areas, and sometimes, unfortunately, more than one.
Okay, that's important to know. I want to talk about something very simple because we are talking about the ear. Sometimes people have a buildup of earwax. And could that be an early sign that maybe some issues are going on that we need to address?
Well, we're lucky that a buildup of earwax is an easy problem to resolve, that once that is removed, then the hearing goes back to whatever state it was in before. So that's generally a pretty easy situation, but it's not in any way an indicator or a signal of something else going on.
So what should we be looking at then in our own life if we are a little bit concerned that we're not hearing as clearly as we used to? Give us some tips on what we need to be doing, and obviously we know that we can contact you at Hear Here to get a good diagnosis.
Absolutely. The signs that you may have a hearing problem, if you don't already have other people in your family telling you that you need to seek help, is that you will make statements, whether it's out loud or to yourself, that everyone mumbles. If they would just speak more clearly, if they would just slow down, if they would just enunciate, I would be able to understand that. And 9 times out of 10, just that statement alone, just from experience, they probably have a high frequency sensory neural hearing loss that prevents them from hearing normally.
So if someone has that kind of an issue going on, tell me about that first visit with you.
What we do at that time is the first thing to do is to examine the ear, to look into that ear canal just to make sure there's not something in the way, something that needs to be removed before the test, as you want to have a valid test. And then we put headphones on the patient and present a series of different tones, and we search each pitch to find out how loud that pitch has to be before the patient responds indeed they heard that. And that plot is what is called an audiogram, or more generally referred to as a hearing test. And that little plot of hearing tells us where the problems are, where the hearing maybe is normal or near normal, and then helps us also to diagnose if the hearing loss is a medically treatable hearing loss. And in that case, then the patient would be referred to a doctor so that we could have the problem resolved medically. If there's no resolution for that, then of course generally the only recourse would be the use of hearing aids.
Okay, well, this is a good time for us to take a break. We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll talk about the various types of hearing aids and we'll debunk some of those myths. Stay with us. Welcome back to Full Circle. I'm continuing my conversation with Susan Rardin. She is an audiologist and the owner of Hear Here. And I'm sure many of you are jotting down her contact information because you may recognize yourself or someone else in the descriptions that she said earlier in the program. Susan, let's jump right in and talk about the 4 types of hearing loss. What are they?
There's the 4 types of hearing loss generally are related to the different parts of the ear that are involved. So the first type of hearing loss is called a conductive hearing loss, which basically means that the sound is not being conducted to the inner ear at a proper level. And that could be due to wax, an ear infection, a hole in the eardrum, or a problem with the ear bones. That type of hearing loss is actually very easy to correct most times. The other type is called a sensory neural hearing loss, and that's where the problem is in the inner ear. The sensory hair cells are damaged, and therefore they're not transmitting the sounds properly. That type of problem is generally not medically treatable. The third type is called a mixed loss, and that's a combination of the first 2, conductive and sensory neural hearing loss. And then the 4th type of hearing loss is called a retrocochlear hearing loss. And that problem basically is from the cochlea, the inner ear, up to the brain and generally involves the nerves and is also not a very treatable type of condition. Most people don't encounter retrocochlear types of hearing loss.
Well, when you go through all these descriptions, it really brings to my mind how complicated a hearing loss can be. It's not just one situation for everyone involved.
That's very true.
And I would suspect then, because of that range of hearing loss, that it's very important for you to identify and then fit with the proper hearing device.
Yes, it is. Very much.
Well, on your website, and we're going to be giving that information out, you have a lot of myths. And so I pulled some of these off, and I do recommend that you go to the hearhearindy.com website. Great information. So I'm going to go through some of these that I picked out, and I want you to tell us whether it's fact or fiction. Many people believe that a hearing aid won't help them.
Many people don't believe that. It is a myth, and a lot of times they are told that by a doctor. Now, generally not an ear, nose, and throat doctor, because he certainly would tell them that, I'm sorry, I can't help you, but your only options would be to go with hearing aids. But a lot of people believe that, that there's nothing they can do.
But we're here to say, yes, you can get help.
Yes, you can.
Okay, myth or fact? I only need 1 hearing aid even though I have hearing loss in both ears.
That's a myth. And for almost all cases, you need hearing aids in both ears. There are some cases where perhaps the one ear is just so horribly bad that it almost interferes with the good ear if we amplify them both. And there are some cases where we either would not amplify that bad side, or we would employ what is called a cross hearing aid, where the signal from the bad side is sent over to the good ear or the better ear, and then just work with it that way.
Okay, I have one more. Myth or fact? My hearing aids should allow me to understand everything I hear, even in noisy conditions.
Well, I like to emphasize the fact that they're called hearing aids because they only aid your hearing. Hearing aids that are properly fitted and properly tuned will help you hear in all situations. It's much easier to hear people in a quiet room than it is a noisy room. And the hearing aids of today are much better equipped to handle background noise, and it won't make it perfect, but we can improve that situation for most patients.
And that's the goal, to improve.
Absolutely.
Well, we are going to take another break, but when we come back to Full Circle, we will meet one of Susan's clients and we'll find out how her life has changed because of hearing aids. Don't go away. With 1 in 10 Americans suffering from hearing loss, our conversation today, I'm sure, is striking into many people's homes, and I hope you do take action if you see yourself in some of the situations we've been talking about with our guest, Susan Rardin of Hear Here. Joining us now, we have one of her clients, Nell Dillian, and I'd like to welcome Nell to the show as well.
Thank you.
Now, tell me how long you have been wearing a hearing aid.
I have been wearing hearing aids since my late 20s.
So when did you first notice that you were losing your hearing?
Probably all my life. But when I was a child, hearing was not a big deal. It wasn't something people really looked at. And so it was neglected. But when I got into my 20s, I was aware myself that it was happening quicker.
So what were some of those symptoms that you were noticing?
I wasn't hearing.
Okay.
I just wasn't hearing people. I'd go to movies with my friends and I'd go away and I didn't know what was happening, as far as hearing. And it seemed like it was setting in a lot faster in my 20s.
So, Susan, there are a lot of negative impacts that start to happen with someone who has lost or is losing their hearing, right?
Absolutely. A lot of people who realize that they may have a problem, but yet they don't want to do anything about it quite yet, and remain in denial for quite a while. But they tend to isolate themselves and pull away from people and stop doing many of the things that they've found enjoyable in life. And you can almost see personality changes between people who were very outgoing and happy, interesting, talkative people will really withdraw. And we also see a very negative impact in the workforce, where people who, everyone else knows you have a hearing loss, even if you don't admit it, and that person will sometimes be passed over for employment opportunities.
Okay, that's important to know. Now, Nell, I understand that this type of hearing loss that you have is actually something that runs in your family. But now that you have these hearing aids and you've been working with Susan for a number of years, how has it changed your life? What have been some of the benefits?
Well, the benefits for me, being a pretty outgoing personality, is that I have refused to let it make me more or less a mole living in my house. And I just approach life like anybody else. So it has allowed me to function in the world.
So did it take you a while to adjust to the various hearing aids over time, or was it a simple adjustment for you?
No, and this is what I want people to know, that this is where you have to have a real partnership with your audiologist. And she is so patient because you have to go out in the world and even make notes, which is what I do. I mean, she will initially give you hearing aids that she thinks works. But then you have to go out in the world because it's very individualized. And if something doesn't work, I write it down when I'm getting new hearing aids, and I come back to Susan, and she will adjust, and we finally get it down to a very fine-tuned situation.
So obviously, Susan, all hearing aids aren't created equal, and they're not all the same price point either. Can you just get an amplifier and that should be just fine, or are there some major differences that we need to know about?
There are differences, and there are generally about 3 different levels of technology, and as you go up in technology, price goes up with that, but performance also goes up with that. So I always encourage my patients to purchase the most hearing aid they can afford. If they can buy a better hearing aid, they will benefit from that. But we all have to work within our own budgets, so I'm conscious of that as well.
Now, I'm so glad that you mentioned that you have a partnership with Susan at Hear Here, because I would suspect that that is a very important thing. I also suspect that there may be some folks at home who are resisting going in and taking a test. Would you make some recommendations? You know, what would you say to somebody if they're struggling with hearing loss?
I would say go have your hearing tested. It doesn't hurt. It's kind of fun. You know, you hear tweet, tweet and little sounds, and she will, you know, work with you on that, and you will find that your life is going to become so much better. The other thing that I want to tell people is that your brain has to work with you too. You have to give it time for your brain to adjust, because your brain and your hearing also are in partnership.
Talk to that a little bit technically with what Nell was talking about.
That's very true, and in fact, they're linking, recently there's been links of dementia and hearing loss, and I think it all goes back to input, but you know, our brain takes in all the different senses and makes sense of it all. The ear takes the sounds and transmits them and sends them up to the brain, but the brain does all the work. We literally hear with our brains, but they only take the information that it's given, and they have to make sense of what they get. So the best we can do peripherally to get the hearing as good as we can, then that gives the brain a much better chance of sorting that sound out and making it useful.
Okay, so Nell, I want to ask you in terms of the battery and the size of the hearing aids. Obviously, I don't even know that you're wearing a hearing aid. Has that changed over the years for you? You mentioned that you started wearing hearing aids in your 20s.
Oh yeah, they've gotten much smaller, but most people, many people, unless I tell them, do not know that I have hearing loss. I don't necessarily advertise it unless I have to, because I think you can function very normally. But they have become smaller and more comfortable to wear. The batteries, you know, they last me actually between 7 and 10 days. Mm-hmm. When they go out, they go out. It's like, you know, your microphone just went dead, right? Which is, and you know, actually it even has, I told Susan sometimes, you have the advantage of when you want to take them off, I can have such a nice quiet time away from a very noisy world.
You know, that's a positive way, I think, to end our program.
Yeah.
You have an advantage. You can break away, but I'm sure many of you want to be sure that you can hear clearly. And if you are a little bit concerned, the information on your screen will connect you with our guest, Susan Rardin. She is an audiologist and the owner of Hear Here, and also one of her clients, Nell Dillian. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Well, we are back after this to hear our musical guests. Don't go away.
Musical Showcase is brought to you by Flannery & Buchanan, helping families tell the story of their loved one's life. Musical Showcase is brought to you by Flannery & Buchanan, helping families tell the story of their loved one's life.
Welcome back to Full Circle. In our musical segment today, we're featuring a brother and sister duo. Daryl Spurlock is on the piano, and Kathy Morris will perform her